And so today's event is being covered by the Neighborhood News Service, which is kind of works, which some of you are familiar with, obviously. Milwaukee, nns.org, if you want to learn more. And it is actually a great vehicle for being able to tell the story about what's going on in our neighborhoods. And hopefully a lot of those stories can be picked up and repurposed in the major media in some form. And a lot of questions have been, in the intermission and so forth, people have commented and said, yeah, this is great, Leo, this is great. But there's always this typical Milwaukee cynicism saying, yeah, but what's really going to come of this? What's going to be the next steps? Well, we do actually have some next steps, and I'm going to talk about those after we hear our next speaker. And I just as a kind of an introduction for Susanna, I think the thing that I believe or that I'm seeing is that Milwaukee is really in the throes of transforming itself. We know where we came from. We were a manufacturing powerhouse, the home of innovators who established businesses that continue to define our local landscape. We also have this interesting episode in our history of socialist government, which espoused an ethic of clean, responsible government and care for the common good. But where are we going from that history? I don't know. But I do believe, and I like the line that Sharon used, we are co-creators of our future. And we are, just as that's true that we are co-creators of what's going to happen in our individual neighborhoods, we're also co-creators of Milwaukee's future. One of the insights that I've gained over the last couple of years of working with Chris Boston is the importance of paying attention to the transformational aspects of our work. In our office, we often talk about our work in terms of transactional versus transformational activities. To create positive change, you have to be really attentive to both. But I admit that I tend to be more of a transactional kind of guy. I like to kind of get things done. My background prior to LISC was as a government bureaucrat. Now, don't get me wrong. Some of my best friends are government bureaucrats, and I have the greatest respect for government workers. But our orientation, and I think the goal of all, really good, dedicated government workers is that we have to kind of methodically go about solving problems and working our way through the maze of government regulations and procedures. And that's very important, and I know there's a lot of really fine government civic servants in the audience today. But we also have to keep our eye on the bigger picture. And hence we have to constantly think about how our work is leading to a transformation of our local culture so that we can create a future for Milwaukee that is prosperous and opportunity-filled for all of our fellow citizens. And part of that transformation involving transforming the relationship between organizations so that we work smarter and more productively with each other. It also involves transforming the relationship between the people of wealth and influence in our community and those in our community who are often left out of the discussion when big decisions are made. There's a lot of talk today about entrepreneurialism, but entrepreneurialism is about more than just creating businesses and making money. It's also about being creative and addressing the challenges that get in the way of creating a future for Milwaukee that is more vibrant, equitable, and opportunity-filled. So continuing with the theme of community transformation, I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, my colleague from Chicago, Susanna Vasquez. Susanna was just named as the director of the Chicago LISC program, but her background is very different from mine. She has never been a government bureaucrat. She's always been a community organizer and a very passionate one. She has been in the business of community transformation for all of her adult life. After graduating from the University of Illinois, she started out as an organizer on Chicago's affordable housing campaign, which was led by the Chicago Rehab Network. She also worked as an organizer for the Chicago Metropolitan Tenants Organization, and then as an organizer at the Resurrection Project, where she went on to become deputy director. She earned a master's degree from Harvard University Kennedy School of Government, and then returned to Chicago in 2003, where she began her work with LISC and became the director of Chicago's New Community Program, which really became the model for our Sustainable Communities program in Milwaukee and in other cities around the country. Susanna has been described as a very savvy organizer, a polished diplomat, and a decisive executive, and I couldn't agree more, and I'm really pleased that she's able to join us today and share her perspective with us.
Thank you, Leo, for that generous introduction. And I'd also like to thank Christopher Boston as well for being the first to pull me to another list city and event. Becoming a new executive director has been a bit of a whirlwind, and I have not stopped to visit any of my other list colleagues. But I knew Milwaukee would be a great place to start. First, I love Milwaukee, and I actually think Milwaukee and Chicago have a lot in common. We have a lake in common, history of immigrants, strong neighborhood identities, and from what I hear, your baseball team went a lot farther than either of ours, so congrats on that. Football team too. I will, everyone in my office knows that the only reason I even know how well that your Brewers did is because I heard it on NPR. I'm not a big sports person, so. I appreciate Leo's comments about transactions and transformation. My personal theory is the only way to get to transformation is through multiple transactions, even when they are only tiny and take a few minutes, like sharing a relevant piece of information or making an introduction, or when they are intentional, like the hundreds of one-on-one meetings that Chris just completed on behalf of the Sustainable Communities Program. These little transactions build trust, they build knowledge, and they build capacity. Ultimately, they build the ability to act. And as an organizer, we learn that power is nothing more than the ability to act. And if we're going to transform our communities and our cities, it will start with a set of transactions. Now, how you go about financing those transactions, how you decide which transactions to take and which to avoid, how they aggregate up to transformation, and critically, how you measure the effectiveness of them individually and collectively. These are the decisions we must make every day in our work. That's the art and the science of our work. And this latter point of how to measure our transformation is where our field is most challenged in advancing its thinking. Every once in a while, an article gets out there that rises above the rest. And I'm old enough, believe it or not, to know that this was true even before internet users propelled memes around the planet in a matter of minutes or hours. In 1997, when I was working for a CDC in Chicago, there was a Harvard Business School article called Virtuous Capital, What Foundations Can Learn from Venture Capitalists. Some of you might even remember this. I came across the synopsis in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and to get the full version, I physically walked over to the University of Illinois Library, found the journal, read it, and made a bunch of photocopies. The article pointed out the need among nonprofits for long-term flexible investment and flexible funding to build capacity. Ideas that made so much sense to me that I sent the copy of the article to every funder I knew. They were also hearing about this piece, but had not seen the original full article, so I earned some points for sharing it with them. It was a transaction. I was simply sharing an article, a piece of information. But sharing ideas and information helped build my reputation and helped me understand that funders like to have grantees share articles and information with them when it's more than just about the grant. That happened to open doors for other opportunities for me and my organization. And that was the beginning of a transformation in the relationship between me, my CDC, and several funders. Another article making the rounds, one that Paul Brophy uses in his assessment, is the 2001 piece called Collective Impact from the Stanford Social Innovation Review. It was sent to me by my former boss at the CDC I worked at, who is now my grantee. So talk about transformations. He pointed out that the article really reflected the practices of Chicago's New Communities Program, your Sustainable Communities Program, and that our practices were aligned with the article's 5 principles, except for one, and I'll get to that one in a minute. Kania and Kramer, the article's authors, outlined 5 conditions that can help neighborhoods achieve collective impact, which they define as multiple actors working together around a coordinated series of activities to effect a meaningful change. The 5 conditions of collective success include a common agenda and a joint approach to addressing problems, a shared measurement system, mutually reinforcing activities with different groups doing what they're good at, continuous communication to build trust and shared language among partners, and backbone support organizations, which of course are our local lead agencies and central intermediary of LISC. It's always nice to find an article or rule book that affirms what you've already been doing, so I liked the article and so did many of our colleagues. But we were challenged by that business about shared measurement systems because frankly, we have resisted such a structure over the years. Sure, we would say measuring is good for counting widgets and tracking overall population and housing trends, but our neighborhoods are too complex. Overall population is infected by outside forces, too big and too dynamic for the results of community development to be easily measured. And traditionally, if I had to choose between $1 for a program, or let's be honest, $1.50 to evaluate that program, I'd pick the program. Our work is so difficult these days, during a prolonged economic downturn, that we might not want too many yardsticks or bar charts measuring our progress in low and moderate income neighborhoods, because the trend lines might be going down despite our most brilliant efforts to push them up. Which brings me to the honest and provocative assessment that Paul Brophy has made for you here in Milwaukee. I know of Paul's previous work mainly through the favorable comments I've heard over the years from my predecessor at LISC Chicago, Andy Mooney, who respects Paul greatly. I read the paper with interest because Chicago, frankly, faces many of the same challenges and neighborhood trends as you do here. And we're working to develop a performance management system that might include measures like those Paul discussed for Milwaukee. Paul identified the strengths in your programs here and the challenges too, and he probably made us all a bit uncomfortable by pointing out the trends in Milwaukee's neighborhoods are not promising. Well, that shouldn't surprise us really. That's what we do. We work in neighborhoods where the situation is often not promising. And after applying our magic formulas, a bit of capital and technical assistance, we want to see something positive come from it. And we should be able to measure those positive things. We should, as a field, get more comfortable with data, have it inform our work, help us set goals, and measure our shared progress against those goals. But data is just information. Data is not knowledge. And in our rush to develop shared metrics and the systems to measure them, we should never lose sight of this. I do not know yet what our system in Chicago will end up measuring or how we will adjust for the complications that neighborhoods present, but I do know that we're going to start figuring it out. We're going to start getting data savvy and data informed, and we will continue to remind folks that listening to neighborhoods gives you a wealth of data. The best community organizers and developers, in my mind, are like human databases about their communities, understanding the trends and what will motivate people to act to change those trends. As community development practitioners, we must start to recognize that we are facing a new divide in this age of information. Not the digital divide. Most research tells us that African Americans and Latino young people use the internet a lot more through smartphones or through Wi-Fi access. No, the new divide is the data divide. Externally developed data is driving decisions about many of the places and people we care most about. And if we are not going to get more comfortable with the data, challenging the data when it's wrong, and generating our own data, we will not hold a seat at the decision-making tables. To do that, we'll have to be very thoughtful and iterative, figure out what data means to our work, building the system and metrics a little at a time, and discovering truths and patterns as we go, just as we did with the New Communities program as we built it. It will be another form of engagement, engaging with people and information, and making sense and strategy from it. Another thing I know is that we're going to need more than the basic types of measurement. What Stony Brook University professor Robert Crease called ontic measures in a recent New York Times article. He thinks it's just great that scientists in Paris have ratified a new standard for measuring a kilogram, using something called Planck's constant, rather than putting a special chunk of platinum iridium on a really good scale, which is what they did until this year. So think about that. Up until this year, a kilogram was measured in this old-fashioned way. And so when folks are saying, community developers, you should have your metrics now, tell them to hold on a little bit. But he suggests that there are more important measures that he calls ontological. Not something that can be gauged with a stick or a scale, but as an experience of how something exists. An experience of how something exists. Kreis suggests that when you look at data sets or yardsticks, we should ask what is missing from the data picture, because in that interpretation of what is missing, we may find truths that will serve our work. So yes, we have to use more data and metrics, but we have to analyze them in the context of what we're trying to achieve. Let me give you a local example. If we're trying to build the economic strength of low-income families, traditionally, folks have told them to save, get an IDA. But List Chicago has learned from its data that credit scores actually matter more. And saving does not increase your credit score. And saving today doesn't even earn you 1%. And we see that, for example, Luis Chavez, a participant in our Twin Accounts program in one of our centers for working families called nationally Family Opportunity Centers, it's not my fault, came into the program with no credit score at all. He did a few things to establish credit, and within 6 months had a score of 649. After a year, it reached 657. Mr. Chavez is motivated because he wants to buy a car, and he knows he'll have to take a loan out for that purchase. And so he's waiting for his score to reach 680, optimally 720, before making the transaction, because that could lower his car payments by $80 to $100 a month, which over the course of a 5-year loan is thousands of dollars. So there's a story inside the data that helps us understand the impact of our work. Rather than making Luis try to save $80 a month and risk not building his credit, or worse, encouraging to save a little bit and maybe skip paying his electric bill, which will damage his credit, we would be implementing a program that in the long run would negatively impact that credit and his ability to save on the loan interest. Here we are trying to see how data creates knowledge, changes practice to achieve a better program outcome. These kinds of numbers not only help track the outcomes of the work, but challenge our own assumptions of what makes an effective program. It demonstrates our program performance so that we can figure out what happened and make adjustments or redirect resources, and hopefully raise more resources because we are more evidence-based than ideological or just transactional. So you can probably feel by now that I'm deeply engaged in this problem of how to solve this missing piece of our collective impact puzzle. And you might wonder why I'd willingly go down this rabbit hole. Well, for one, our major funder wants us to. But there's more to it than that. In today's data-driven world, we are all being called upon to make tough decisions and choices. How are we going to make these choices without good judgment and good information? If you can't talk numbers with my mayor or my police superintendent, at least here in Chicago, you can't get the work done. And as the new executive director of List Chicago, I'm all about getting the work done and maintaining the high standards that we've established in List Chicago over the past several years. You already know that I'm the executive director of List Chicago and that I ran the New Communities program before that, so you know what I do. But you probably don't know much else about me or why I took that job. And the difference is one I learned from my years as an organizer. The difference between the what questions and the why questions. The difference is, if I may say, more ontological than ontic. One thing that prepared me for this job, of course, was 8 years of work under my predecessor, Andy Mooney. But I began down this path because of my earlier experiences. First, studying history as an undergrad that taught me to value the process of change over time and space. Second, working as a community organizer, which taught me that power is fundamentally about organizing people and organizing money. And third, through waitressing, which was my first job through college and after college, which taught me the value of serving your customers. Growing up, I was raised by a single mom, and we moved a lot. I was usually the only brown kid in a predominantly white suburb, and one of many brown kids in the subsidized housing we lived in. I was drawn to community organizing because it brought together the one thing I longed for growing up, a sense of community, a sense of place, and a sense of people, and a way to address the injustice of race and housing status. But the work is tough, and after my first 8 years in the trenches, I took a break, leaving a CDC in Chicago called the Resurrection Project and going to Ecuador, where I was born, where I met my future husband. We got married, and I enrolled at Harvard to study public administration. And then I took a job as a program officer at LISC. I had my reasons. I had been recommended for the job by Susan Lloyd. Thank you, Susan. You changed my life. But at that time, having worked at a local CDC, I didn't have a favorable impression of LISC. It was, stop me if you've heard this before, that downtown intermediary taking the money that funders didn't want to invest directly in neighborhoods. Yes? Okay. But I was finishing up at Harvard, and immigration policy said I needed a job to get my husband's visa to come to the US. And as word filtered out that the MacArthur Foundation was going to invest significantly in LISC Chicago's program, I heard from several of my colleagues that it would be a good idea to have me on the other side of the fence. So I took the job, which at the time was a transaction, but it has genuinely led to a transformation. On the personal side, over the past 8 years, I've started a family. I have 3 beautiful, healthy children under the age of 5 years old. And they're all up the street at the DoubleTree as we speak. And we are headed over to the Milwaukee domes tonight for some Halloween festivities. Because of my job, I have been able to support my family with an exceptional work-life balance. Professionally, being NCP director has given me a once-in-a-career opportunity to support communities in the world as it should be. Thanks to the 10-year commitment by MacArthur, I was able to implement my own version of venture capitalism meets collective impact. I was able to implement an amazing program, the New Communities program, which has been a wild, risky, and stimulating experience. I've helped start new organizations in neighborhoods that had no organizational capacity, worked with the best examples of public officials, learned how to build complex programs from education to youth employment to technology, and helped develop a new generation of diverse community development leaders. And I do believe we've made a collective impact. And then another opportunity came along when I got the news of my predecessor leaving LISC to join the Emanuel administration. I was on my last maternity leave at the time, and all I wanted was to be a good mother. So my first reaction was, I don't want that job. But I also wanted to be a good person. And I realized that it was my time to step up. Achieving collective impact begins with individual leaders who step up, who get themselves organized to develop a shared language, a shared vision, and yes, shared measures of success. We must never forget that it starts with each of us understanding what motivates us to act. What motivates a neighbor to volunteer after a long day of work? What motivates a city official to align their resources with a quality of life plan? What inspires a philanthropist to invest in an intermediary like LISC to be the backbone organization that helps get the work done? When times are challenging, as they are now, I tend to fall back on what I call my community development existentialism. Yes, life is absurd, yet we must create meaning from it. Yes, community development is full of challenges and trends that are not promising, yet we must act. One of my favorite philosophers is Søren Kierkegaard, who wrote, "What I really need is to get clear about what I must do, not what I must know, except insofar as knowledge must precede every act." Knowledge must precede every act. So to recap my motivations, the first phase of my career was about me wanting to create the community I did not know. My most recent work enabled me to create the family I did not have. And now, in this age of information that moves at the speed of light, I see my work as building the knowledge to act effectively and efficiently, passionately and intelligently on behalf of neighborhoods to make them more resilient and supportive places for the people who need resilient and supportive communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. That was really great. And I thought some of your remarks really worked well with some of the previous comments. It was also kind of blended into Paul's report really well, too. We're going to open it up for questions, so if you do have questions, feel free to raise your hand. But maybe to start things off, I'll be Mike Goucher, is I guess one question that came up in a lot of these conversations and also with the panel and in Paul's report is making the connection between neighborhood work and the broader regional economic economy. And I think one of the things that we struggle with in telling our story is trying to make that case. Would you give some reflections on that and how you've tried to do that and how we might be able to more effectively make that case?
I'd be happy to give some comments in terms of where our thinking is at, though again, I really want to emphasize, though there are some similarities and difference between Milwaukee and Chicago, we are really struggling around the same issues, and so I do think we can continue to learn together on that. There's a lot of regionalism speak from Bruce Katz down to Chicago as well, and one of our main emphasis is a couple of things. One is in Chicago we have a neighborhood called Inglewood, where it's probably one of the most challenged in the city, devastated by foreclosure, almost more vacant land than people at this point, but a real strong history of folks who care about that neighborhood. And one of the things that someone has shared recently was that, Chicago's bond rating has gone down because the unemployment is so high. If we don't solve the problems of neighborhoods like Inglewood, it impacts the whole ability of the city of Chicago to get financing, right? So it doesn't matter how many people are employed on the north side if we are not figuring out the problems of our toughest neighborhoods, because you can't just pick up Inglewood and move it outside of Chicago, right? You gotta solve for the problem of place and people. So that's one issue. Now regionally, there's also just the general connection of, in Chicago, in our metropolitan region, the fact that we have lost population. Over 200,000, a large amount of the population loss was African American, which is, when you break it down more, middle-class African Americans and some white population. There was an increase in Latino and Asian population. But again, if we're losing people to the region, then we're, again, not holding on to the talent that will make the city stronger. And lastly, we've been really looking at economic development in terms of how neighborhoods aggregate up and either provide the workforce for the region or how they can provide the materials for businesses and suppliers in the region. So honestly, we're also at the starting point, but I think Chicago sees its central point is to keep saying our businesses neighborhoods, and the regional discussion might be happening, but if people think they can step over neighborhoods to get to the region, I think that they're mistaken.
Any questions or comments? Go ahead, T.
Could you talk about what are some of the performance measures that your primary funder is asking you to collect for your New Communities program? Is it more, the crime rate goes down, or is it measuring how many people show up for meetings? Sort of what are those things that they're actually looking to collect, and how do you go about collecting?
Sure, so, and Susan Lloyd's going to smile a little bit at this. For those of you who don't know, Susan Lloyd was the director at MacArthur Foundation, that is the funder we're referencing to, when we were starting the New Communities program. And on the plus side, and this was under different leadership at MacArthur, there was sort of a agree to disagree, I think is the fair way to say it, at the first start, which was the right way to do it. And we also didn't really start evaluating the program in any sense of it until we knew we would have a program to evaluate. So we waited a couple years until we knew something was off the ground. I'll respond to your question in two ways. One is I think when you're in innovation and scale-up mode, it's a very hard time to figure out metrics and measurement and evaluation. And so there wasn't a lot there. Our basic measurements were progress against the quality of life plans. Were the projects moving forward, tracking our investment, and critically tracking our leverage. I do think in the past and moving forward, folks should not underestimate the value of leverage as a critical, quantifiable measure to the work we're doing. If we are working in disinvested neighborhoods and you make investment that draws in more public and private investment, that to me is an indicator that something's working. People are choosing to make investments in neighborhoods where they were not, philanthropic, private, or government. So we've had that metric throughout the course of the program. But because the nature of it is comprehensive and it is so much about planning and processes and people and things that emerge out of it, there wasn't a lot more than sort of a formative evaluation. Here's what they said they were going to do and here's what they did. And those two line up pretty well, so that's a pretty good program most of the time. In fact, Ann Kubish from Aspen Institute was like, finally, we've gotten to implementation. And so that was like a big deal, the fact we're actually implementing plans as opposed to just planning. Where we're at right now is MacArthur is looking to renew a grant, but very interested in saying, okay, MacArthur's business is community level change. We want quantifiable community level change. And after about 2 years of going back and forth on that's not possible, it is possible, that's not possible, it is possible, where we are moving is something we're calling testing the model, which is taking baby steps, but significant ones at saying, just because there are 1,000 reasons to say there's no way of knowing if comprehensive community development is moving a needle on a community level, doesn't mean you don't start asking more questions and figuring out how does data inform our work, how do we develop shared goals, and at least benchmark and document our progress against those goals, and at least getting our folks to think beyond just getting it done project by project, but collectively, where do we see ourselves in 5 to 10 years if we were successful in education, if we were successful in reducing gun violence, and working backwards from that to develop sort of a theory of development, and figuring out what are some reasonable, not causality, but correlated indicators that we're making progress. So we are literally at the beginning stages. The only reason I took this, I told Chris, my proposal is done. So this is my celebration weekend. So again, I think this is something that we will keep our colleagues up in the field on, but the answer is we don't know yet, but we're beginning to work it out.
Just a follow-up question on that. A lot of the times the work we do in neighborhoods ends up being the argument, well, what would the neighborhood look like if we weren't there?
Right.
So is there any conversation about comparative data to areas that is not receiving that organizing or those resources?
We've had MDRC, which is a pretty well-known evaluation group out in New York, be the evaluators on our program. And there were attempts at looking, broadly speaking, at housing trends and crime trends and SBA loan trends, things which we didn't think were actually very applicable to our work directly, and comparative neighborhoods. I'm personally not a believer in that. I don't believe you can do triple-blind studies and give a white NCP pill to this neighborhood and not to that neighborhood, because there's so many other variables and histories of what's going on. I think that it's valuable to compare the trends of a particular neighborhood you're doing work with compared to other ones in citywide averages, but I don't think you can make any really solid links between them. But that has been done in the past. The way I always said it, what we were being evaluated against, if the trends looked good on my behalf, I didn't feel like I should take credit, and if they looked bad, I shouldn't be blamed, because I don't think that there was a robustness to say that there was a relationship.
Sharon, go ahead.
Yes, I'm Sharon Brown with the Milwaukee Neighborhood News Service. I was hoping if you could explain a little bit more about the ontological measures that you were talking about, and particularly an example of how you look at what's missing.
Yeah, that's a great question. I risked by putting that in there, but it really struck me when I read it in the New York Times. And communications is one of them. I have to admit, and I'm really excited to hear about your news service. We have something called our Chicago Neighborhood News Bureau. So for example, I think we actually see the most important value of our work, and something that builds on your last question that we are getting in our next round of evaluation is social network analysis. We know intuitively that the processes we've been doing, having people come together, develop a shared vision, having a plan, and advocating for resources on that plan, and building the skill set to get more complex types of programs done, and communicating the success of that at the neighborhood level, has created stronger networks. And those networks are things that you can measure, but over time we've just seen grow and have documented in a way that our neighborhoods are the go-to neighborhoods when you want to get something done because those networks exist. To the communications point, we've actually done a huge amount of investment. At the start of our program in 2003, less than half of our groups had a web presence. And so with MacArthur help, we solved for that, creating a very innovative grassroots website that allowed folks to get a web presence. We've now advanced to what we call neighborhood portals, where it's sort of Web 2.0 technology that folks can contribute news and information about their neighborhoods. And we do things like looking at Google Analytics, and the news that's coming from our neighborhoods and flowing out of our neighborhoods is skyrocketing. And we know that this matters ontologically because if one of our neighborhoods, Humboldt Park, and we did this and showed it to folks, when you would Google Humboldt Park, literally the first 3 articles you would get would be someone getting shot in that neighborhood, right? And that's your experience of Humboldt Park. If you're Googling it to decide, should I open a business in Humboldt Park? Ooh, 3 people got shot. Probably not. Well, when you Google Humboldt Park, you now see the Humboldt Park portal. And what are the stories on that portal? It's about the businesses opening and the activities going on, et cetera. And yes, they cover tough news, but it's also covering the positive things that are happening. And so you get a different experience of even what you get when you Google. And everyone starts by getting information in that manner. So I think that's part of what we're saying. Is that a community level change? Maybe not, but it is significant for those neighborhoods and changing perception of those neighborhoods, which, as we know, leads to a great deal of market decisions.
We'll just take one more question. Susanna will stick around if people want to have a conversation with her, but Steve, why don't you be the closer?
Okay. Do you foresee in the future the time when evaluative decisions and even funding decisions will be made by individuals in these communities versus the top-down approach that's done now? Understand what I'm saying?
What kind of decisions?
Well, as far as, what impact the service providers that are working in these communities are having. Are they really addressing the needs of the community? Who should know that better than the people that we're actually serving? But right now, we kind of take the data, do the evaluation, and then we'll give them some report back, but I don't know if we necessarily put it in a format that they understand it, because it's mainly for the funders.
Right.
So I'm just trying to say, how do we reverse that approach to get people that live in these communities to really help them to understand what does data really mean, how it's really impacting them, and making them be the determinants of who does services for them versus somebody else determining who does services for them.
I'll respond to it in 2 ways. One is, and again, this is the part that I've loved about my work with new communities, is in some ways what we've been trying to do is tilt the power towards the neighborhoods on decision making and resource allocation. To MacArthur's credit, the first significant 10-year commitment to our neighborhoods, which was $50 million over 10 years across 16 neighborhoods. When you do the math, it's not a lot, but we've made it a lot. The way LISC deployed those resources is radically different from traditional philanthropy. We had a lead agency, so a local group that had sort of servant leadership, right? They had to bring people to the table to define this quality of life plan. And that plan guided our investment decisions. And the program officer wasn't tasked with saying, I have health dollars and safety dollars or whatever. We had flexible dollars, and they flowed based on the capacity and what was set in the plan. Now, there was always some negotiation, but decisions were made by that local community coming up with a plan and saying, this is what we're ready to move on. Now, related to the service provision, this is also something we built into our program. We all know that some neighborhoods do not have indigenous social service entities providing services, and so sometimes we have to rely on citywide entities that I believe mean well but are not going to be accepted within a neighborhood, and maybe won't be held accountable in that neighborhood. Because we have that local lead agency structure, which I really want to emphasize is super important, even on the collective impact frame, it can't just be a citywide backbone organization. You have to have a local backbone organization. Because even whether it was a Center for Working Families or any other thing, that lead agency tells us when it's renewal time, if we're funding a service provider in that neighborhood, are they doing the job? And I'll give you one example. We were starting up a new Center for Working Families that provides employment, financial counseling, and whatnot service. And it was a citywide provider who was being brought in to do it because there wasn't a local group with the capacity. And one of our lead agencies sent in what he called a secret shopper. He sent in someone to take advantage of the services and see how he got treated. And he wasn't treated really well. And so at the partnership meeting we had, that he does have a seat at the table with the alderman and the city college and the service provider, he brought a secret shopper. And it's like, I'd like to introduce Mr. So-and-so, and I want him to explain the experience he got at your service site. And that was a real way of saying, you're going to address these services and the challenges and be held accountable, because otherwise LIST won't make its resource flow. Now the other part, in terms of how do we impact city government, I do think, again, where the backbone organization comes in really critically. Cities have budget meetings and people yell and scream about this getting cut or that, and then the city goes away and then it has to make its decision. I think intermediaries play the role between when the budget meetings are happening and when budgets are being implemented to say, we can help you get resources flowing to these neighborhoods efficiently and effectively, and we're going to leverage more in. And so we kind of play that role of trying to, if not bring those voices to the table, try to represent in true honesty what those voices would say if they're at that table. But I do think as we get more data savvy and are able to go toe-to-toe with city officials, we can either counteract the data that they're using to make decisions, because it's not always accurate, or at least balance it off with what I call local knowledge data, which is, we know better than you what our neighborhood needs.
Okay. Thank you, Susanna. LISC actually works with two agencies to operate a financial opportunity center, Journey House and Riverworks, and I saw Daryl's and Michelle's ears really perk up when you told the story about the secret shopper. So that's a great idea. I also want to, just a few announcements. Well, I just want to also acknowledge, I mentioned the Neighborhood News Service. I also want to acknowledge the Milwaukee Courier, which is also here today, covering this program. And just in making closing remarks and talking a little bit about next steps, I first want to draw your attention to the salmon-colored paper in your packet and encourage you to start to fill it out even as I'm making the final remarks. And I hope what you will do on this is also, feel free to use the backside, write long notes, tell us your suggestions and also ideas of follow-ups or how we might, where we might take this conversation. And then also, we do recycle. So there are baskets at either door. Give your name tags on the way out. Also, if you want to stay involved, if you're not currently in our network of contacts, please leave your business card with your name tag, or put the contact information on the feedback form. Right, I was going to get to that. Based on so I think that it's been a very good discussion today, and it's really been a pleasure to be a part of this whole conversation. And like I said, we do want to keep the conversation going. I think I hope that we'll all be able to think about our works in terms of this framework of collective impact. But we have some difficult work ahead of us, and I think one of the more challenging areas is going to be this area of defining goals and measurements, but I think it's an area that we too need to wrestle with. In terms of next steps, Paul's report talks about a number of different things. Some of the things are in terms of getting the resource, what did he call them, the resource providers and the resource users, or the stakeholder groups, and he had recommendations for both of those entities. LISC is still working very actively with this group of funders who are basically the funders that, the core group are the funders who actually underwrote the cost for Paul Brophy's assessment, which are listed on the bottom of his report, which is in your packet. We're currently working with them, and we're continuing to work with them to figure out the next steps in terms of formalizing more of this funders group and also bringing other groups into it, including, I was really pleased to see that District Attorney John Chisholm was here for most of the morning's program, which I think really is a testament to his willingness to be a part of this conversation. We've also had some really good conversations with some of the local healthcare systems, including Frederick Hospital, represented by Claire Reardon, and also Bob Duncan over at Children's Hospital, that are very interested in this conversation. So we want to continue to widen or broaden the table of institutions that are working on this issue. In terms of continuing this conversation with community stakeholders, like I said, we at LISC intend to continue to do that, and your feedback on the information forms will be helpful to us in doing that. But I do want to, as Bethany mentioned, call your attention to a few specific flyers in your program that speak specifically to that issue. One is that UWITA is sponsoring their annual Community Development Summit on November 29th, and there's information in your packet about that. And again, it focuses on one aspect of our shared agenda, and it was mentioned in some of the focus groups about Milwaukee's leading role in terms of developing food systems and urban agriculture, and their summit this year is specifically going to focus on that. Paul Brophy in his report talked about doing an inventory of our community assets, and really what he's building on is some work that was done by John McKnight and some of his thinking about our neighborhoods being places of assets and opportunities. And we're really fortunate that Marquette University and Cardinal Stritch is sponsoring a series of events which actually you'll have a chance to meet and be a part of a conversation with John McKnight relative to that whole area of activity. And then there's some additional follow-ups that are going on. There's one sheet that kind of highlights three different things. One is a farewell reception for our colleague Beth Dufek, who's moving to Seattle. But also it talks a little bit about this equity summit, which is really also, I think, a very relevant and interesting follow-up to the conversation we're having today. Again, a delegation is being, what is 50? 40 people are from Milwaukee are going to Detroit to be a part of this national conversation dealing with how do we insert greater equity into into the conversation that's going on. And then I guess the more specific thing that I would like to point out is that LISC sponsors quarterly forums, quarterly happy hours too. But we also, they're happy hours, but they're also with kind of a focused agenda on a topic of I think that you help us identify related to areas concerns. We're having our next forum on September 6th at what used to be called Arts Concertina Bar. Now it's Koklansky's Concertina Bar on 38th and Mitchell in the neighborhood. And you're welcome to join us there. And then also to suggest other topics for the forum. And actually one topic that actually Susan Lloyd suggested to me, which we're definitely going to do, is in Paul Brophy's report, he talked about the reinvestment fund out of Philadelphia, which actually did this assessment of trying to kind of profile different neighborhoods. Because as was pointed out, a lot of our neighborhoods have different needs. And so this was a very systematic way of trying to identify how different neighborhoods are different and what their different needs are. And so one of the forums, I will assure you, early next year will be a forum discussing that approach and helping us to understand it and hopefully create, again, an effort to kind of embrace that and actually engage that process here in Milwaukee. And so I guess the other point I want to say about all this is I really like the mayor's comments about just do it. I think what he was really saying is don't wait for government to, don't wait for government to do everything. Is that we have the capacity to make a lot of things happen, to generate a lot of energy around a particular strategy or a particular topic. And if we collectively have that energy and that enthusiasm for it, don't worry, government will be there. They will be there to support the effort. But I think we have to take the initiative to start the ball rolling. So Is there anything else, Dawn, that I need to mention? Okay. Well, then I guess that we will close now. I also want to acknowledge and thank Paul Brophy for his work in our community. I want to thank Chris Boston, who did a great job of sponsoring these listening sessions and capturing that content. And of course, I want to also acknowledge my colleague, Dawn Hutchinson-Weiss, who's a great stage manager, our communications director. So thank you all for coming, and let's keep, what is the one line that someone uses? Proceed till apprehended.